Hello, I'm Ed Raby, otherwise known as the Rabid Atheist. Welcome to my channel. You'll feel free to like or dislike this video, so please feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. Some channel news. I have my first subscriber. Thanks to Jonathan for being the first. I do have a simple goal of 100 subs. After that, I want to get to the all-important ability to monetize, which requires 1,000 subs and 4,000 hours of viewing time. So watch, like, and subscribe to help me out with that. For the main discussion today, I want to turn to my 4 theological objections to Christianity. These are things I found to be objections I personally could not shake off. As a professional theologian, as a biblical scholar, I couldn't find any way to get around them without being very logically inconsistent or just plain making stuff up. So I eventually categorized these and put them all together into 4 theological objections. And these are pretty strong and pretty standard, but this is my viewpoint on them. I was originally going to post like one of these over the next 4 weeks, but I think I've decided just to go for it and get these 4 done and out of the way. So probably what will happen is I'll post one on Monday and then one on Wednesday, and then I'll do the other 2 next week on Monday and Wednesday. That way I'll get them all done. I kind of have a personal reason for doing that. I've always left it open that if anybody can come up with a good reason why I should discard these objections, that I would reconsider it. So it's always an open question. I'm not one of those people that is really going to spend an entire lot of time dealing with, things that I don't necessarily agree with, but at the same time, if somebody comes along and says, hey, I have an idea you may not have considered, I'll consider it. A caveat to that, though, understand that if you come to me and say, well, have you considered this part of the Bible? Yes, I have. Have you considered this argument? Yes, I have. If what you're about to tell me is either plain face in the Bible or, quite frankly, something that's very commonly known in Christianity, don't bother. Remember, I have 40 years as a Christian, 20 years as a minister. I have degrees in Bible. I have degrees in theology. Yes, I've probably considered what you have to say. You better listen to my objections and then kind of come back and say this might be a possible answer. Now, for me personally, of these 4 objections, I started with the second one, which is sin being an unreal thing. But eventually came to consider the most important from a faith point of view in Christianity and in Christian circles, and that the Bible, the 66 books of the Protestant Bible, which includes, the 39 books of the Old Testament, 27 books of the New, being God's Word. We're talking about the idea here of something being having the 3 I's, being inerrant, being infallible, and being inspired. And the claim of Christianity is the Bible has all 3 of those qualities. Now, by inerrant, mean that there is a theological view of the Bible that the Bible contains no errors. It is inerrant. It has no errors. It has no logical inconsistencies, so on and so forth. When we talk about the Bible being infallible, that's a little different. It means that when we talk about the Bible's claims, that they are true, that is incapable of being in error necessarily about its claims. That's what it means to be infallible. By inspired, we mean that God somehow was actively involved in the inspiration behind the Bible. He either inspired the words, inspired the authors, came down and dictated, and the people were just secretaries dictating his words, so on and so forth. We're talking about God having an active hand, not being passive in the Bible, but being active. Now, I will hold out that some people believe that God is a passive inspirer of the Bible, and on that grounds, I'll deal with that a little bit later. They may have a point from a certain point of view. And so all of these things have a multiple meaning. There's also lots of different ways that the Bible could be inspired. So we're going to have to take a look at that a little bit. I'm going to take each one of these things, the idea of the Bible being inerrant, being infallible, and being inspired in order. Um, I'm going to say right up front that this is a general overview. I could easily do a video on each one of these by themselves, but I don't want to do that. I just want to give an overview because my main objection is I don't believe that the Bible is God's word. Okay, and I use the main forces of these three to say that. I think inerrancy is the easiest to show that it is garbage, and I don't use that word lightly. Inerrancy basically says there's no mistakes. There's no problems with the Bible, that everything is done rightly and correctly. I don't say that necessarily lightly, but anyone who has read the Bible honestly and objectively and can see that many modern translations even take the trouble to point this out, that there are indeed errors in the Bible. There are what we call textual variants, where one manuscript says one thing and another manuscript says another. Probably the most notable for Christians is that the longer ending of the Gospel of Mark, that Mark stops about verse 8 and then doesn't continue. The older manuscripts stop there, but ones that are newer, closer to us, have an addition that adds a whole bunch of things about the resurrection. But I don't think the original version of Mark actually had a resurrection story. And so that's kind of one of the things that makes a good example of a manuscript note, that the oldest manuscripts do not have that longer ending present. And that is just one of thousands of those kind of errors in the Bible. So sometimes people add to it, sometimes the scribe copied something wrong, but the current copies of the Bible that we have today can not be qualified as inerrant, having no errors or flaws. And so you can't really make that claim. So this is where some of the denominations, when they make their statement of faith, will add the idea of original autograph, that in the original time when that author of that book sat down and wrote that for the first time, that was inerrant, that was the inerrant word of God. And unfortunately, because of the copying process, we have a very error-filled Bible and stuff with a lot of errors. But that doesn't really help us that much, does it? We don't have access to the originals. None of them probably exist to this day. So that's kind of a claim that is hard to falsify. And anybody who's ever studied how to make an argument knows that any claim that you make does not have, that you don't provide for yourself a way that your claim can be falsified, is not a very good argument. You run into this a lot in theology, where people make this insaleable theological argument, and they don't offer up any kind of idea of how that it could be countered, or this would be what falsifies my idea. And that's actually a very weak argument, not a strong one. Just because you come up with this quote-unquote flawless argument, the main flaw of that argument is you don't point out a way that you can show it to be false. In science, we don't do that. We automatically say this is the way you can show the claim that it's false. And if I'm going to look at inerrancy from a scientific point of view, you make the claim that the Bible is inerrant. I simply point out its errors, claim over, you lose. And that's not something that Christians like to hear. But here's the thing about that from a philosophical point of view, maybe looking at it from a certain viewpoint. We supposedly have the most important message from God, but it is also very clear that God has had very little concern to correct the corruptions that have obviously started to creep into the Bible. That these scribal errors, somewhere along the line, God doesn't come down and say, hey, fix this. There is many times where things are logically inconsistent, where there's contradictions, where there's clear additions, even though God says don't add to this because it'll bring about a curse. But that seems to be very standoffish of God. Why doesn't God come down and fix this? If this is such an important message that every human being on the planet Earth needs to hear it, it seems like that God would have been supernaturally involved in making sure that the scriptures stayed inerrant, that there were no that when a scribe sat down to try to write something differently, immediately God would tap him on the shoulder and say, hey, that's wrong, you need to write it this way. Doesn't happen. The fact that flawed human beings have copied the Bible over the years and have demonstrated and put errors into it clearly tell me that no, it's not inerrant. But suppose we can get rid of inerrancy. Maybe, so what? Not maybe it's not a him. Maybe it's still infallible in the sense that the ideas it presents about God, the things that it presents about God, are still true. So even though these scribal errors and these longer endings and these additions have come about, the main claims of the Bible can still be demonstrated to be true. And I'm going to give an example here of creationism, the idea of being a literal six-day creation from Genesis. Genesis chapter 1. The issue here is that if this claim could be falsified, then that would say that that particular chapter is not infallible. Infallible means that the claim is demonstrably true. Now, the problem with six-day creation is that I very much am of the opinion, and many scientists are of the opinion, including Christian ones, that the idea that this planet is merely 6,000 years old is just demonstrably false. There are many YouTubers that take on this question. That's not really my expertise. But the one thing I have learned from watching all of them is that they give good sources, and it's demonstrably proven that this idea of six-day creation just cannot be true. The biblical flood story with Noah's Ark, there's just no way that boat will float. And I know enough about physics and chemistry from high school to look at some of the explanations that creationists give for some of these things and go, no, that wouldn't work. Okay, it just doesn't make any sense. Also, creationists tend to be a little bit vague about things, and they also tend to not want to define some of their terms, which is very dishonest. If you're going to be honest, define your terms, get out there and say what you mean. Like I'm doing here today, I'm defining what infallible means before I talk about it. Many have pointed, that maybe just because that's not infallible, other parts of the Bible might be. But now we're beginning to get to the point of opinion. Because some of the claims that the Bible makes, well, now we're starting to talk about what could be right. Now we're getting into the realm of opinion about what is infallible. And by that very nature, we're not talking about truth anymore. We're talking about truth. We're going to start asking what truth is. And we're going to start to undercut the whole discussion of truth because we can't even show that the Bible is infallible in one area. And once you've shown it infallible in one, you have to say that it's very possible for it to be fallible in another place. And that's what you have to consider. One good example of this, and I'm going to make this claim when it comes to the evolution debate versus creationism. There's a lot of people out there that are theistic evolutionists. That is, that they believe in a very old earth, and this is the way that God did it. They may take a very deistic view of God, or they may take a very Bible-based view of God. But, these people in their ancient mythologies just didn't get it right. Well, that brings up another problem. And this is where I think the creationists make a valid point. If any part of the Bible can be shown to be infallible, the claim that the Bible itself is infallible is falsified. You have to start talking about which parts of the Bible are infallible and which parts aren't. Once again, we're going to start to get into a lot of opinion. I think theistic evolutionists don't realize the implications of their position. If the creation story and the fall story are completely false, that they didn't happen, then the answer for all the problems, which later on is taken very literally, is also false and based on nothing. There's no point to it. But I'll get more into that in my second and third objections. So maybe the Bible isn't inerrant. Maybe it's not infallible. Is it inspired by God? When we talk about inspiration, we're saying that God had an active hand in it. Maybe it can depend on your definition of inspired. There are indeed many schools of biblical inspiration. I'm going to deal with a couple of them that I have held, the two that I personally held over the years. One of them is verbal. The verbal inspiration of Scripture was required by the Assemblies of God for me to believe. It was one of the things that I had the most problems with because I could definitely see the errors in the Bible and I could see the fallibility of certain parts of the Bible. So this idea that God inspired the thoughts and words that people were supposed to write and that they got it down right and correct was a little bit far-fetched to me, so I discarded it. Later on, I became what was called a dynamic inspirationist, where I believe, much like Jesus, like the doctrine of Jesus Christ, where you have God being 100% man and 100%, God, that the Bible was that way too, that it was written by very fallible men, people, but they were inspired by God to write and to deal with the situations in a godly manner, and thus things came out. And so there you have it. You have it in God, word still inspired, 100% inspired by God, still very much part of man's things, so it's 100% man, 100% God. The real problem is, of course, is a logical quandary. You have to say 50-50. But also, I had absolutely no proof for the divine inspiration part. The whole issue of inspiration is whether God had an active hand in it, and I still couldn't provide any objective proof for that. It was pure faith, and faith is believing something in something you want to be true without any evidence. Now, I know Christians often run to Hebrews 11:1 for their definition of faith. But even if you were to break down that definition of faith, it basically says your faith is proof that your faith is true. That's a nonsensical statement. It's absolutely, and it kind of is one more thing to prove that the infallibility of the Bible isn't true. Because if you're going to be infallible, you shouldn't have nonsensical statements like that in your book. I think if there is any way to say that the Bible is inspired by God, there are a couple of possibilities, which is why I have three other objections. The first possibility is that God is the subject of the Bible and therefore its inspiration. Kind of like an artist will look at, say, a bowl of fruit or a model and take their inspiration from that bowl of fruit and do a painting. In the same way, the writers of the Bible were looking at the subject of God and were inspired to write about the subject of God. Now, the thing about this view of inspiration is you can then indeed allow for other people's opinions, but you can't say that God necessarily took an active hand in inspiration, and that's where the line begins to become a problem. Because now we're simply saying that a bunch of these people wrote about God, but they didn't necessarily take their orders from God. And that's something you can't have. Well, there's tons of books like that. You can go into any Christian bookstore, any religious bookstore, and find tons of books inspired by God in that way, not just the Bible. So that's not a very useful definition of inspiration. Other people say, well, maybe it's inspired history in certain places where people saw God acting and they wrote down some of those actions. The real problem with that viewpoint is this, that if that's the case, then you think that they might get the history right. And even according to the Bible's own standard of 2 or 3 witnesses for any event, many of the events in the Bible are standalone. In the New Testament, for instance, Peter being told to go drop a line in, get the fish, and pull the coin out, there's only one account of that. When you look at lots of things in the Old Testament, including Genesis 1 through 11, only one account of it. And so it fails by the Bible's own standard of testimony. And that happens a lot in the Bible. But there's other historical facts that we have looked at that we can't find. Probably the most glaring thing that I've ever found about the Bible is we have a ton of knowledge about the history of ancient Egypt. You know what doesn't appear in any of that history? The fact that the idea that the Jews lived in the land of Goshen for 400 years makes no appearance in any of the Egyptian history. And we can't say that, oh, well, the Egyptians erased it. Yeah, they've tried to do that with other things before and failed miserably because other people copied it. The Egyptians were meticulous about writing a lot of things down. There is no evidence that a group of people led by a guy named Jacob headed into the land of Goshen, stayed there for many years, had a son named Joseph who eventually became the vizier of Egypt, which would have been mentioned. Not there. There is no historical way. I can't even really say that the Bible's view of history is that good. At best, you can use it as a secondary support source to other historical sources. And even then, you have to do it with the caveat of maybe yes, maybe no. So, inspired history? Maybe. And if we say it's inspired in the same way that an artist is inspired by the world around them to do a painting, it's not very good for us, and it's not very useful for us. What I have left was that the Bible is nothing more than a book of legends and mythology. That a lot of people take that legend seriously to the point of believing it's true, and at one time that included me. Now, one might argue at this point, why do I have the need for two or three? If the Bible is gone, why do I have to get rid? Well, because not everybody's always convinced by my first objection. They try to hold on to the Bible being inspired as true. And it's this idea that it's somehow still actively inspired by God in some way that becomes the question for the other three objections. And that's why I continued on. I said, okay, well, can I still hold on to the Bible as somehow that maybe God was actively involved? I just don't know how to make a distinction. And thus I can still hold to some of the things of faith. The problem is some of those things that are very central and core to Christianity as parts of faith have massive problems, starting with sin being an unreal thing. Thirdly, we can go on to my third objection, which is the solution for sin not only is unnecessary if sin doesn't exist, but the actual solution is kind of bonkers and quite frankly silly. And the fourth objection, when we get right down to it, is the God of the Bible is really a very unpleasant kind of dude. And we're going to talk about those other three objections because we have to deal with the idea of the Bible being inspired, that maybe God had some active hand in parts of the Bible. But how would we know? I can't deal with all of them, but I think I can deal with the core doctrines of Christianity and hit those. But as a way of reviewing, the core is my objection to the Bible being the Word of God fails. It fails because it's demonstrably proven not to be inerrant. It's not infallible. And it's certainly its inspiration by God is extremely questionable. And the few things that we can get from the inspiration of God still can be questioned. And that's going to be it for today. Once again, I'd like to welcome you to my channel. I did have one comment from Jonathan, and he said something to the effect that religion was basically started when the first con man met the first victim. I would agree that that's what religion grew into, but the ideas behind religion have a little bit deeper origin. And just as an aside, I would say that Christopher Hitchens is probably a little bit correct in saying that religion was probably mankind's first and very baddest, worst attempt at understanding the universe around him. We just didn't know very much. And so we came up with answers based on a lot of ignorance. And eventually they became codified into religions. And then con men use religion to take victims for a ride. Just a reminder, my comments will always be addressed probably in the next video. I like doing that. I like a little bit of interaction, so that was nice to have a little fun there. The one thing, of course, I won't tolerate is name calling, just a reminder of that. Be sure to like, subscribe, and get your notifications all situated so that you can always get new videos. And as always, hopefully, I can someday convince you to be a rabid atheist yourself. I'm Ed Raby, Rabid Atheist. Have a good day. Goodbye.